Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for 2024 State of the Practice 10 Public Engagement Trends in Transportation. This webinar has been literally 18 months in the building, and I could not be more excited for all of the people that are here. We've had over 900 registrants for today's webinar. We're so appreciative for the American Planning Association and the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation for co-sponsoring today's webinar. Let's get underway. My name is Dave Biggs, and I've got a picture up on the screen just so you can see what I looked like the last time I took a headshot. I am Social Pinpoint's public engagement strategist, and I'm pleased to host today's session. I'm going to start with the agenda. The agenda for today's session is quite simple. I'm going to describe the process around which we've created these insights, and I'm going to talk about the top 10 public engagement trends that we learned from this research fairly quickly at a pretty good, I'm going to go at a pretty good pace because I want to leave most of the time for our panel discussion to reflect on the insights that we gathered during this research. And then we're going to open it up for a Q&A. And so at any time during today's webinar, if you think of a question, don't hesitate to use the question box to type it in, and we will get to as many of those questions at the end of today's webinar as we can. So fire away. So let me start by talking about the genesis, the purpose, and the need for the state of the practice process that we're talking about today. So this, let's go back 18 months ago. So we were at the Transportation Research Board annual conference in Washington, D.C., and we were particularly at the committee meeting for the Committee on Communications and Public Engagement. As we do every year, we gather some of the best practitioners and most avid researchers around the country looking at public engagement and communications. And there was a sense in the room of kind of an uneasy sense that there's been so much change happening. And there was a sense of vertigo. We didn't know where we were at. And this is pretty remarkable since these are some of the best experts across the country all gathered together. And there's a sense of where are we at with this? There's been so much change as a result of the pandemic, as a result of technology development and so forth. And so there was a real need to kind of take stock of where we were at. And there was no real sense of a state of the practice report. And so we quickly recognized that this was a need, and there could be no better room to put together a bunch of researchers than that room, the committee meeting for public engagement and communications at the Transportation Research Board. It was really wonderful how people came forward around this idea. So, just to name a few, we've got Jeff Moore and Claudia, who were the current and the former chair of that committee for the TRB. We have Tina and Eileen, who are consummate researchers who are involved in so many research projects. Jamil, Susan, and Eileen are also representatives of DOTs, so a great deal of expertise there. Lloyd, who's now at HDR, but before that, he was the Director of Communications at AASHTO. So again, finger on the pulse of what's going on with DOTs, particularly around communications and engagement. Myself, and not last but not least, of course, Amy Luft, who's representing the MPO contingent here that was so important in this research. So thank you so much for this team that came together to conduct this process with us. Very quickly, we were blessed with several different industry associations coming forward and saying that they wanted to help. We've got AASHTO, AMPO, the APTA, American Public Transportation Association, and then on the regional and county front, we've got National Association of Development Organizations, National Association of Regional Councils, because transportation engagement doesn't only happen in DOTs and MPOs, and of course, at the center of this, the TRB. Thank you so much for these partnerships. It was really so helpful to have not only their reach, but their expertise along the way. So when we were thinking about doing a survey of the community and where we're at with public engagement, we were hoping to get 100 different agencies' responses on this. Well, we blew that out of the water, and it was testament to the efforts of our partners and our researchers. We got so many responses from MPOs, DOTs, and governments of all kinds, as well as organizations, associations. You can see from the type of responses that we get that the majority of the responses didn't come from public engagement professionals. It came from planning professionals, executive and leadership, and communications all across the board. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later as well. It's very indicative that we're hearing the best person to respond to these surveys oftentimes is not a public engagement person at these agencies. Overall, we were just blown away with 431 responses from agencies across the country, 211 MPOs, and 43 DOTs. After a while, we were thinking, can we get all of the DOTs? And we tried really hard. We got the vast majority of DOTs and MPOs. So wonderful response. So let's dive into what we learned. So this is kind of the top level trends and findings from this research. We first asked people about their goals and objectives. We wanted to ask an open-ended question. So we asked people in a sentence or two, why is public engagement important to your agency? And we clustered the responses in different categories. By far, the most important goal and objective that agencies express is they wanted public engagement to inform their plans with better understanding of the community's needs. So actually, in a distant second and third, less so was building awareness and trust and meeting requirements. And so really, when we think about optimizing our public engagement activities, we really should be most aware of the most important objective, which is to inform plans going forward. Then we started asking some questions about barriers to progress. So what kind of holds you back as an agency? So we asked, how do you feel that the following factors have limited your agency's progress? And so when we look at these responses, a couple of things come out for me. So limited resources and staff were by far the biggest barriers that people expressed. You can see that the majority of agencies are finding limited staff and resources as significant barriers. Lack of training was also identified as a barrier. And interestingly, it's not because there's no leadership support. Lack of buy-in from leadership was, for most agencies, not at all a barrier. So this is interesting that we're lacking the resources, but we have the leadership support. So we're going to be talking about that as a panel, I'm sure. Next, let's dive into the division of labor. So we asked a number of questions around how people staff public engagement. And so one of the questions we asked was, for projects that are smaller in scale or projects that are larger in scale, what percentage of those activities are, for public engagement activities, are conducted by consultants? And you can see that, very surprising to me anyways, that the vast majority of public engagement is conducted by staff itself and not outside the community. So in most cases, the staff is conducting public engagement, over 60%. And on smaller projects, it's over 80% of public engagement being performed by staff. And as we know, the smaller projects are far more frequent than the larger projects that might come along every couple of years. Smaller projects are happening multiple times a year, many agencies multiple times a month. And so the vast majority of public engagement is being done in-house by staff. So let's turn it over now to a poll question. So let's bring up this poll question. Approximately how many staff does your organization employ whose primary role more than 50% of their time is public engagement. So there it is. So the responses are coming in. So how many? So I realize that some of you might be working at consulting firms or engineering firms. There's also many people here working at agencies. So that's why depending on what your kind of organization, how many staff do you have whose primary role is public engagement? So most people have weighed in here. I know it's like hard to add up, but just approximately. All right, we'll give this a few more seconds and then we'll roll it up. Okay. All right, so the response is back. So the majority of people have 1 to 5 staff whose primary role is public engagement. 19% have 0 staff. So interesting. So let us look at what our responses were in the community. So we asked the same question of the agencies that were responding. So primarily MPOs and DOTs. We asked them this same question. And here's what they told us. You can see that the majority of agencies have very few staff whose dedicated role is public engagement. Very few. Many agencies, 42% of agencies have 0 staff that are focused on public engagement. So this says to us very clearly that a lot of public engagement is happening by staff, and it's happening by staff whose primary role is something other than public engagement. Maybe it's engineering, maybe it's planning, a variety of other disciplines. So this is pretty interesting. Then we asked people some questions about engagement tools. So one of the questions we asked were on throughout the course of a project, how often do you engage only in person, only online, or both online and in person? And this was what they said. So what's interesting to me here is how prevalent hybrid engagement has become. It's very, very clear that the majority of teams out there are doing both online and face-to-face, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes asynchronously. And it's also interesting when we kind of look at the comments back that social media and things like websites are being used as in supporting roles as opposed to primary roles. So that's quite interesting that that hybrid engagement has become so much more the norm than it has been in the past. And this is one of the areas where if we reproduce this process every couple of years, it's going to be interesting to see how the tool set changes over time. Then we started to dive into level of satisfaction. So we asked people a couple of areas, how satisfied they are with the results that they're getting for public engagement. And you can see that for many teams out there, they're finding that when they do engage people, they're able to collect useful, constructive feedback coming back. When it comes to the level of participation, there's a little bit less happiness, a little bit more moderate kind of responses. You can see that in terms of number of participants, very few are very satisfied with the results, and several teams, particularly MPOs, are unsatisfied with their level of participation. And then mostly, the most important finding, I think, here is when we ask them about the diversity of responses, we see significantly more tentative responses, unhappiness. And you can see that the level of satisfaction across the board, not that great. So what we're hearing from this is there's lots of room for improvement for many teams, and particularly around the diversity of engagement. You see that only 31% are satisfied with the diversity. So then we started asking people, because this was an interesting topic, which specifically audiences they find most difficult to engage. And so it's very interesting here that, limited English, young people, racial and ethnic minority groups, lower income groups were very, very difficult to engage for most teams. Look down here, the audience that is least difficult to engage is seniors. It's not surprising when you look across a public meeting, you see a lot of gray hair. I'm sure this is like no surprise to a lot of people that seniors are the easiest to engage. When we're talking about long-range transportation plans, I know that we're very interested in engaging a more diverse demographic than that. So this is interesting. And when we looked at the comments, people were adding that they're having a difficult time reaching people who are positive or neutral about something. So that tells me that the people who are engaging are people that are maybe a little bit angry or afraid of what's being proposed, or have an axe to grind. So people who are positive or neutral are a little bit harder to reach. So note, like, how do we diversify not only the demographics, but how do we diversify among people that have a diverse set of viewpoints out there about projects? So I'm going to open up another poll question here about your motivations for improving your public engagement. So let's pop open this poll here. So what motivates your organization to improve public engagement? So pick any here that apply to you. So are you interested in seeking broader, more representative involvement, seeking to understand or meet public priorities, gaining public support for projects, or meeting expectations of local, state, or federal agencies, or avoiding the backlash of the community that could be brought about by a project that's unwanted? So where do you sit in that range? So I think most people have weighed in there. We can see out in front is seeking broader and more representative public involvement, seeking to understand public priorities better. So let's have a look now at what the community said when we asked them this same question: what motivates your agency to improve? It's interesting to us that there's so many factors, and the scores are not that dissimilar from each other. So 5 is strongly agree. So you can see that all of these factors are above 4 out of 5 in importance. So the message here says that there's a lot of reasons for improving public engagement. Slightly out in front, much like you said, broader reach, more representative, and better understanding public priorities. So consistent with the folks that are online today. And I'm going to pop up one more poll here about the challenges that you face when engaging the public. So which of these challenges apply to your organization? So is your organization challenged with low public interest or participation at meetings? Is your team focused or challenged with lack of staff or funding? Are you challenged with engaging a more diverse and reaching traditionally underrepresented groups, reaching beyond those that are strongly opposed, and raising the agency's reputation, awareness, or brand? So which of those resonate with you? You can select any ones that apply. I'll give you a few more seconds to respond to that. We've still got some people weighing in. Out in front is low public interest participation at meetings, followed, out in front is engaging diverse underrepresented groups, followed closely by low public interest and participation at meetings. All right. Let's see what people said when we asked this same question. So by far, the most responses came back telling us that they're mostly challenged by participation, generally feeling around that it's more difficult to gain interest than it has been in the past. So it seems to be, from the perspective of the people that responded to the survey, getting harder to gain interest. There are the theories out there that there's just a general apathy, there's distrust with the organization, there's just a lack of time. People might be very busy with families and multiple jobs, and people have a short-term focus. So weighing in on things like long-range transportation plans maybe is not relevant to people or seen as being relevant. There's still a problem with the NIMBY crowd. Not in my backyard still skews feedback, and so engaging with people that are not directly affected by something. So if you're engaging on something that's place-based, there's lack of interest. If you're putting in a highway, then you hear only from people that are right next to it, these kind of things. And I feel for the MPOs. So many MPOs responded to this, say, people just don't know what an MPO is, what it does. They've never heard of us. And so it's very difficult to get people to come and participate in a process if you're an agency they've never heard of or they don't know what function you provide. So I feel for MPOs specifically. People know what a DOT is. People often don't know what an MPO is or does. And the last category here, key finding number 10, the future of engagement. So we ask people an open-ended question here. Because public engagement is changing so much, look ahead for 5 years. What do you think the future of public engagement looks like? And I think it's not very surprising that the information that came back was pretty technology focused. Increasing online engagement. It's been dramatically increasing for the past several years. Continued shift to hybrid engagement is I think happening. It'll be interesting to see in 2 years if it's even more than it is now, or if we've reached kind of saturation. We had a lot of comments about the changing role of social media. I think originally when social media first came out, people thought this is a great way to engage people, and people are seeing that that's not necessarily true. There's a lot of kind of toxic nature of social media, and people are finding that they're not getting very structured feedback from social media. So its role is changing a little bit in terms of using social media more as an awareness and a promotional tool to direct people to maybe a more controlled survey or something like that to get structured feedback, particularly around the questions that you have as an agency for the public to weigh in on. 3D, virtual reality, enhanced GIS, a whole litany of different technologies people felt were going to become more and more mainstream, more and more accessible to the public in the process. And a lot of interesting comments around AI. And so, using things like AI to predict maybe where the resistance might be about a project, so we can strategize around reaching people that are going to have the most meaningful input to the process. So we're not starting from scratch every single time, that we're learning from our past projects and enhancing that with updates as we go. So I'm going to put on the screen just a summary of those top 10 points. And at this point, I want to bring into the conversation the panel. So I'm going to welcome the panel now. I want to welcome 3 of the colleagues that I listed at the beginning that were instrumental in helping this process to come about. Amy Luft, who is communications coordinator at Compass in Idaho, Jamil Robbins, who is the public involvement leader at North Carolina DOT, and Lloyd Brown, who is associate VP at HDR, and as I mentioned, the former director of communications at AASHTO. So welcome to all of you. Amy, I'm going to kick it over to you first, and I just would love to invite the panel to each just spend a few minutes reflecting on the top 10 findings. Which of these resonate with you? What advice do you have for agencies that are struggling with these similar issues? So firstly, over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate you spearheading this effort, both the survey itself as well as this webinar. I know a lot of the results really resonated with me at the MPO. And so I guess it's nice to know we're in good company. And so we'll see where that goes. I'm going to speak mostly to kind of items 6 through 9, kind of combined in your list there of working with people trying to get in people to be interested in things that they see that are intangible or very long term, and a difficulty in communicating those. Most of us in transportation, we think of short term as being 5 to 10 years. For many members of the public, short term is next week. And so then when we're talking long term, especially as an MPO, when we're looking at 20 to 30 years, that can be very hard for people to grasp. And then I will echo your comment earlier of lack of knowledge of what an MPO is, really does exacerbate the issue. Everything from getting people's attention to just ensuring people that an email they get or something they get isn't a scam if they haven't heard of you and are afraid maybe to click on a link to a survey because they don't know who you are. But we really run into issues with that lack of tangibility and the lack of immediateness in what we do in transportation planning in particular. We have a culture, particularly with our youth, of, kind of an instant gratification. And then we also have a lot of people, and it's really those difficult to reach audiences in many cases, who have much more legitimate immediate needs. If you think back to your college days and you have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the bottom two are food and shelter, and then above that is safety. If those are your needs and your concerns, the future of the transportation system is not on your radar. And so that can be really difficult, especially because the people that are often being most impacted by our decisions are those that are not involved. From a long-range planning standpoint, as you mentioned, youth are difficult to reach, yet they are inheriting a transportation system informed by the public engagement of an older generation. Those who are disadvantaged and maybe have fewer transportation options are being impacted by transportation made by decisions of people who have many transportation options. And so being able to participate really is a luxury for people who have the time, who have the resources to be able to do that. And so it's a big challenge I know I face, and from seeing in the survey, I think that we all face. So the question is then, what can we do about it? And I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect answer. I think it's something we're all going to continue to struggle with. One thing I know is that I think all try to do is bringing public engagement to the people. Don't say just come to our meeting, but how can we meet you where you are? But I also think there are some things that we can do, kind of thinking back about that hierarchy of needs and how we can do a better job of tying those transportation input options with those immediate needs. Help people see how this could affect your safety or your child's safety, how this could affect your ability to get to work and therefore to be able to support your family, and help to really cater those messages and those conversations to the issues that people do care about, to help them see that something will make a difference in their lives, not just we're looking at making some changes to the system. Another thing we can do is offer incentives, which I was excited to learn this year at TRB is becoming something that maybe is more doable with federal funds. We have in the past, we have often offered simple incentives, but maybe there are ways, again, to tie those to some of those immediate needs. A gas card for participating, or some sort of a bike helmet for a child, or something that really does impact those needs, to be able to essentially help pay people for their time in a way that is meaningful to them, and not just you get a drawing for a gift basket, but something that can truly make a difference in people's lives. And then finally, I do think we need to recognize that we're always going to struggle reaching with some of those populations, and definitely take advantage of and work closely with the advocates for those populations, knowing that they are there very often to speak for those groups. And while they're speaking for the groups as a whole and aren't able to represent each individual, it is an avenue that I think we can do a better job of taking advantage of, to be able to get some of those messages back to us, and also to be able to help share some of our messages in those public involvement opportunities with a lot of those audiences that we have a difficult time reaching, to make sure that their voices are heard in those decisions that really do have the ability to have a big impact on their lives.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, so many good points that you covered there, Amy. Always good to hear from you. Maybe now I'll give Jamil the floor for a few minutes for his reflections, and then Lloyd, and then we'll open it up as a free-for-all to comment on each other.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. And the topic I want to focus on is around staffing, because I think, to me, that's a critical piece of having an effective engagement program. And specifically, after 20 years in the industry, to me, of utmost importance is having a centralized, dedicated public involvement team to guide and oversee your engagement efforts across your agency. Here in North Carolina, we are decentralized. However, our communications office and our public involvement team are central, and we work with all of our divisions. And that there's a few reasons that benefits that I want to bring out of why that is important. One is consistency and communication. Having standardized materials are important. We have a fairly large state. We have different regions. It runs from the mountains all the way to the coast. And people own property in different areas of the state. And so for us, it's really important that if you have a property in, say, Wilmington, North Carolina on the coast, and you're impacted by a transportation project, or you have a home in Asheville where in the mountains where your vacation home may be impacted. If you go to a public meeting or view public meeting materials, they need to be consistent, right? And one of the other things that my team does with our consultants is in guiding and overseeing the engagement efforts is making sure that materials are written in plain language, right? One of the I guess the tips I mentioned to project teams is WWGT, and that's what would grandma think, right? So when you're preparing materials, if you write those materials as if you were explaining it to your grandmother, well, they'll be in a position for pretty much anyone to understand. And so that's important. And also having a centralized team leads to having standardized policies, right? So again, going back to standardized materials, that is extremely important. We have a writing style guide. We have all of these things that our teams follow, again, providing consistency across the state. Also, having subject matter experts is important, because we all know there's no one-size-fits-all approach to engagement. Public involvement is very nuanced. I always say a 1 mile widening in one part of the state can have different issues, or be very different in terms of issues, concerns, or controversy, because values differ across communities in different areas of the state. And then finally, having dedicated teams and subject matter experts is important, because it allows agencies to stay ahead of trends and continuously improve on your engagement methods. And so having a dedicated centralized team can improve consistency. It allows for better resource management, and that leads to more effective engagement.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jamil. And that really resonates with me. And I'm looking at the fact that the vast majority of public engagement is being done by people who don't do public engagement as their main job. And all of a sudden, we're expecting hybrid engagement to happen, both face-to-face and online. And I can imagine people feeling overwhelmed with, I don't have time for all of this. And so I think that resonates with me, is like just not overwhelming people and having people be able to focus on the public engagement task and the technologies and so forth. Over to you, Lloyd. Last but not least, and then we'll open it up. So, Lloyd, what's your reaction to all of this?
Thanks, Dave. And again, I want to echo what Amy said earlier. We just in the industry really appreciate your leadership and taking what was really just a kind of a conversation that we have all the time on things and actually making it happen. And that's the kind of leader you are, and so very much appreciate that. Dave and I have talked a lot about this, and others have talked a lot about this, but really what struck me as I was initially going through the results was that section on barriers to progress. And Dave mentioned it earlier, but I'll just reiterate it here. The people who responded to the survey described limited staff and limited resources, also identified training as kind of barriers to progress. And yet the lack of buy-in or agency culture was not. So what I think it points to, well, it could point to, I think it deserves some follow-up research, is that our leaders are on board and they're supportive, but maybe we just have a general lack of funding for transportation or for infrastructure investment or planning or this outreach just generally, or a lack of understanding of what it really takes to do the full public engagement that we need to be doing. So a misunderstanding of what the right-sized budget really is for a robust engagement program. And I think that points to the second thing that I would argue was significant as I was going through it, and that's the satisfaction with the results, with the public engagement results. 65% of the people who responded to the survey said that they were very or moderately satisfied with the constructive or how useful their results were from public engagement. 60% said that they were moderately or neutral about the number of participants, but not happy at all with the diversity. So we've already talked about that a couple of times. And that suggests that there's really no single tactic or engagement strategy that's going to reach the entire population. As we're seeing in our politics, as we're seeing in our media across the board, the streaming media now, and all the ways now that you can get the NFL on throughout the week on all the different streaming platforms, we have fractured, and our communities have fractured. And so therefore, having a robust website is a good place to start. Having a public meeting is an important strategy or tactic, but that's not enough. It's got to go further, and it has to be more creative and more balanced and more reflective of the audiences we're trying to reach. And then finally, I'll wrap up with this, Dave. We'll get into the questions. I think that the findings of this survey point to the fact that public engagement is a team sport. And when you look at the way that people described the number of people on their teams, there's quite a few that said 5 or fewer, or some that said 0. 20% earlier today said 0 when they answered. That means that the people who are doing public engagement are not necessarily just public engagement professionals. They have other hats that they wear. And when we go back to that earlier concern about barriers to progress, one of them being the education or the training in all of these various tactics, I think we have to expand the training out beyond just our public engagement teams and make sure that we're having that conversation across organizations so that people who are perhaps engineers or people who are planners or people who are environmental permit specialists, that all of these people have a broad understanding of the strategies, tactics, or at least the principles of healthy and robust public engagement.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks, Amy, Jamil, and Lloyd. Wonderful thoughts. Always great to hear your ideas. So why don't we take a few minutes and just any comments for what each other has said? Let's just do that for a few minutes. So Um, Amy and Jamil, if you want to unmute yourself, any reactions to what the others have said?
I'll jump in and comment on what Lloyd said about kind of the tension between support, but at the same time, lack of resources and budget, and that perhaps that is due to just a misunderstanding of what it takes. And I definitely would echo that. Not only I think, lack of understanding of the financial resources needed, but also the time that things take. And I think that that's unfortunately kind of broadly public participation communication is seen as being kind of quick and easy. And to do it right, it really does take a lot of time and expertise. And I think people understand that it's needed, but I think the level of work that's involved is misunderstood.
Yeah. I mean, that really resonates with me. I don't know, Jamil, if that resonates with you, but the the same 10 people that show up to every public meetings are remarkably easy to engage. And as soon as you get a difficult to reach audience, it's not going to be as easy. The same resources are not going to get you there. You have to do something different. It's going to require you more work. So each audience that we try to engage, that's more and more difficult to engage. We have to put in the resources and have the different strategies. And as Lloyd said, different tools for different audiences. All of a sudden, we're expanding the expectations around all of the things that a public engagement person is doing, and then knowing the fact that they're probably also doing planning or engineering and a bunch of other things, and they're only doing it part-time. It seems like we need to educate leaders on the complexity of the role that we have, and maybe also at the same time see if we as an industry can try to make it easier for people that don't do this all the time and don't have these conversations all the time to get up to speed on what some of the leading teams across the country are doing. Jamil, what do you think?
No, I agree. I think, and going back to my point about having a dedicated subject matter expert speak to that. What people around here, I always say we're the Chick-fil-A of DOT, right? Because our project managers they have a lot on their plate, and they need to focus on their level, on their area of expertise, and let us be the easy button and really take the pressure of the public engagement efforts off of their plate, right? And I think that's important. I think to echoing Lloyd and what you said about the different audiences, how we communicate with them, really speaks to the importance of having a public involvement plan for all of your projects, right? Making sure that you've looked at the demographics, you talk to local planners that understand as much as you can about the community, and looking at the potential impacts of a project, and knowing how to communicate. Some of it is going to be the in-person small group meetings with some of these underserved populations or rural populations, right? And, but online engagement tools, right? The virtual public involvement really has broadened our outreach, but it doesn't reach everybody. So again, right. Yeah, really tailoring, going back, it's so nuanced. So really tailoring your approach to the particular project and community is extremely important.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that really resonated with me when I looked at all of the results together is the absolute need for targeting difficult to reach populations. And targeting is the key word there. So how do we actually get an audience with people that are difficult to reach? Why are we not reaching them in the first place? Is it because they don't trust the agency? Maybe they're from another country and they're not used to being asked their opinion. They don't trust that they have anything useful to say about it. They don't know transportation, so how can they comment? There's so many reasons why people are not engaging, and I think we have to understand those reasons and then tailor a response to them. And one of the things that has really got me excited is the ability for social media to target to a specific demographics, and to to say, hey, maybe we have targeting in Spanish to invite people to participate, and it takes them directly to a survey that's in Spanish, and these sort of things, and we can say we only want this to be sent to people that are over the age of 60, that are in this particular demographic. So targeting is so possible with that. But as you say, Jamil, we can't reach everybody with online engagement. So what companion opportunities are we providing for other people? And one of the things that Amy said really resonated with me is like the importance of community groups that have the trust and the ear of the difficult to reach audiences already, partnering with those groups, whether we engage them directly or we ask them to bring their group to the engagement. I think that's important, particularly when there's lack of awareness or lack of trust, if you can use their voices. And so, that's my reaction to what you said, Amy. Like, whether we use those people as proxies or we use them as a vehicle to bring the audience to us. And I'm not sure, in different cases, probably different results. You seem to be leaning towards the using them as proxies. So any comments about that?
I think that both are important depending on the circumstances. I think we at least have done more in trying to use them as a vehicle, and we haven't really taken advantage of using them as a proxy. So I think that's where my mind is I think it's an area that I need to explore more. But I think that depending on the circumstances, either or both can be very valuable. We, for instance, have teamed with a lot of refugee organizations. We're a refugee resettlement community, and used their English language classes as opportunities to engage with people. They needed people to come in and speak to them in English. And so we had conversations with them, which was kind of just a different way of reaching out to people. So I think it really depends on the circumstances between using them as proxies or vehicles. We just haven't used them as proxies as much. So I'm interested in exploring that more.
Yeah, I just want to follow up and build on this a little bit, where the conversation seemed to be heading. And one of the things that I've been working hard on recently is really asking the people who are the project managers, what data do you need? Because part of it is understanding the communities we're working in. Part of it's understanding what is it that the people running the projects or programs need to accomplish. And because if you don't ask that question, what you get is, I need this done by August. Well, that's not enough to work with. That's just a timeline. And then you're making decisions based on what's most convenient or expedient, and you're not necessarily making decisions on what the right answer is to get the project or program the right data that's necessary to make the informed decisions. And so I think that part of that is training that we discussed earlier. Part of that is helping people understand what it is that we do. But it's also, on our part, being curious about the project or program we're working for, asking the extra question, digging in and learning the infrastructure or the program, the plan that we're trying to support, and what its priorities are. It's working both ways, and asking that extra question, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I have, the advantage with an MPO, I'm with a smaller agency, so it's a little bit easier to sometimes have those conversations. But I actually will sit down with our staff and essentially force them to tell me exactly any question they want asked, exactly what that answer is going to do. How are you going to use that, and how will that inform the project? Because to me, the other big piece is, I often hear from people, well, I just want to ask it because it would be interesting to know. Right. And if we don't have a use for it, we're wasting the public's time and trust, and we're wasting our own resources. So I will push back and actually make people literally draw me out a chart that shows this question will go to this decision, because we have run into a lot of, that would be really interesting, and it would, but it's not going to help us get our project done.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to your list, not only is it not a good use of time, but it's probably frustrating the process because if you ask a question that doesn't impact the outcomes at all, then you run the risk of frustrating people to say, I told you this and you went and did the opposite. Why did you ask in the first place if you weren't willing to listen to the public? And so I think it's really important. Well, all three of you are saying that we need to key into the role of the public and what decisions do the public have to make that's going to inform or change or adjust the plan, and ask those questions, because in doing that, when we actually can demonstrate at the end of it that the public told us this and so we did that, you build a culture, a reward system built into it to say, I participated in that and we changed the outcome. That's the kind of thing that encourages public participation. If we do the opposite, then you're eroding public trust. And so I think all three of you are supporting that. Ask the right questions at the right time and do something with the results. And so I think that's critical. But again, all of these things require more thoughtful public engagement process with limited staff and limited resources. So that's the challenge that we're faced with. And so what we have to do, and I'm going to just wrap up one thing here, and then I'm going to open it up for questions because I know that we've got a lot of questions coming in. We're so grateful for the community around Social Pinpoint, that really informs us on what's working, what's happening in the community. It gives us a vantage point, really, of understanding what is happening. And so, it's a responsibility that we take pretty personally. We've got now 3 different tools under our banner: Social Pinpoint, Consultation Manager, and MetroQuest. And as a result of these clients, what we have is kind of an ear to the ground. And so one of the things that is screaming out for me is to look across the industry of what's working and why is it working. So looking at case studies and saying, what is it that the leading case studies that are engaging the most diverse audience or the most people, what are they doing? And what can we learn from that in terms of best practices? Whether you're using, Social Pinpoint or any of the other tools, what are the consistent messages in terms of what's working? And so that's where I kind of wanted to bring it back into, it's really important for us to learn from each other because so many things are changing. And so one of the things that we do is we try to see what are the patterns out there. And so, when we look at case studies, we look at, for example, this one from Sandag. What is it that made this one so successful? What are the elements of it that drew people to it and why? And so what can we learn from this that we can generalize to kind of inform the industry in terms of what's working? Like this one, collecting comments on a safety map. Where are the safety issues? What was it about this experience that made it so popular? It's important for us to learn from as many case studies as we can. So before I open it up for Q&A, I'm just going to open up a poll because we're trying to do as much as we can to help the people that come to these webinars go through their process of building their strategies and their engagement process. So what is it that you would like from us that perhaps you haven't gotten so far or that you're curious about before I open it up for Q&A? So here are some things that we might be able to help you with as you go through with your process, in terms of, and one of the things that I mentioned is providing you with examples of best-in-class community engagement sites so you can play around with them and learn about what teams that are having the most success are doing. And in this way, regardless of what tools you're using, maybe replicate some of those decisions and some of those engagement strategies. Or if you want more information about the tools that we provide, certainly happy to provide that. Or if you just wanted to compare and contrast but with different approaches, or just get some feedback. We're happy to serve you in any way. And of course, we're going to be using the results of this state of the practice to try to custom design a set of resources and future webinars to try to address some of the challenges that you've expressed. So stay tuned for that. So I'm going to close that off and let you know, before I open it up for Q&A, that we have created a wonderful, colorful 60-page report with the results that we've talked about here, so that we're going to send to all of the registrants for today's webinar. So stand by for that. There's a summary at the beginning, which, and of course, an appendices that goes on and on with all of the data. So if any of these results in the high level overview are interesting, you can dive right into the data that was used to produce those. So stand by for that. We're also going to send you a copy of the recording for today's webinar. So if you want to replay what these wise panelists have said, you can do that. We're also going to send you the PowerPoint. So if you want to see those top 10 lists or anything else, you can do that. A whole bunch of questions have come in, so let's just go through them. So do you have any suggestions on how to improve outreach to the groups that you labeled as difficult to reach? I think we kind of got there. That was asked early on. Interestingly, difficult to reach groups are historically underrepresented. Yes, they are. And perhaps it's time to change methodologies and approaches. So, well, we addressed that one, I think, fairly well. Now, admittedly, this is not enough time in this webinar. We're opening so many cans of worms today, and we're going to take a year and a half to address all of these things in different webinars and resources. So, one thing that I will suggest here is there is a wonderful conference coming up that you should be aware of called the Conference on Advancing Transportation Equity. It's going to be taking place in Baltimore in July. It is the second annual conference in advancing transportation equity. There's going to be so many wonderful presentations there, including a presentation by us. And I believe Jamil is going to join us for that. We have a wonderful panel put together. But aside from our presentation, there's going to be just days of presentations on transportation equity. So look that up. And we're also going to be writing a guidebook to parallel with that, specifically around how to engage more diverse population, particularly online. So what options do we have on increasing diversity online? Here's a question. How do we measure diversity within participants? So when you're engaging and you're engaging a whole bunch of people, how do you know you're engaging a diverse population? So Amy or Jamil or Lloyd, so how do you keep track of who you're reaching and who you're not?
Well, I'll start. I think there's a few ways. One is the eye test, right? So who came out to the public meeting? And then we also have our Title VI forms that are voluntary, and that's kind of hit and miss on participation. But we can use those things. But the eye test really helps us out. And when we have projects that impact underserved communities, there's one or two ways we go about it, right? Depending on the complexity of the project and the potential impacts. Sometimes we'll schedule the general public meeting and see if people from that community come out. If they do not come out, right, from the eye test, then we make sure we target them by reaching out to what we call a LARC, a local area resource contact, which is could be some local leader, community activist, local business owner, or elected official that represents that community, and work through them to set up meetings and disseminate information. So we'll go to them. Or if we know it's a direct impact and maybe a major impact to that community, we may start with small group meetings prior to the general public meeting. But those are kind of ways we go about it.
Ours is very similar to Jamil. Any public comment form or survey, we will ask some demographic information at the end of the survey. Generally, race and ethnicity, age, gender. We also will ask for zip code, which helps us. We have a central city and then a very rural area, and one of our local difficult to reach populations are just our rural residents in general. So that helps us as well to see if we were reaching those rural residents. And then we will also go out with targeted meetings in certain places or with certain populations to try to reach those that we're not reaching. One other thing we will do when we ask that demographic information is also ask how people learned about the opportunity to be involved, to see how we can maybe tie those two together, if we can see trends in different populations learning about ways to be involved through specific means, if we can do more in that way or maybe less in some other ways that we're not getting the participation.
There's so many good questions here. I mean, I'm awash in great questions. And this is impossible to address in this kind of context, but I'd just be curious on how you would respond to this in a brief way. How can we address situations when we find that an elected official's position are opposed to the views of the harder to engage populations or groups that have been historically disadvantaged? I mean, this is just an example of the great questions that are coming in, but I mean, this is obviously, this webinar could go on for hours and hours. I know we're not going to do that today, but anybody want to weigh in on that particular icky wicket?
Not a chance.
No, I think it, you have to lean on the feedback you get from the community to show that there is a discrepancy, and then the discussions at a higher level can take place from there, or the public is very engaged and they force the change. So it's but just documenting the feedback and showing those differences to those local officials can affect change. But that's a very difficult question, though.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is probably one of the most difficult questions, and certainly not something that we can really address here. But I think also there's a lot of nuance. I mean, it's almost like a cartoon-like question, because it's not as easy as that. We're dealing with systems of transportation, which is multiple modes and all kinds of things. And it's about shifting priorities from this particular mode to that mode. It's not about this project, yes or no. I mean, it's not as simple as that. We're dealing with systems. And so oftentimes there's more subtle addressing of the barriers that a disadvantaged population is experiencing, which can be done. Oftentimes we can do both things at the same time because we're dealing with system-wide changes. It's not as simple as maybe that question. Oftentimes, I mean, sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's not. So a little bit more of a tangible question here. Could you provide more input about the hybrid approach? So when you're doing hybrid, any of you, what do you mean by hybrid?
For us, it takes, I mean, we have different combinations of hybrid. Every project pretty much gets a web page. Sometimes our hybrid approach is creating a project informational video that we post on the web page, because even when we hold our public, we have a traditional public meeting and we're the best show in town, everyone can't make it. I mean, people have active lives, and so making sure that we create a informational video that has all the information that would be at that public meeting available online, and then drive people to our website to provide feedback. That's important. I mean, we've had hybrid meetings where we have a simulcast of we broadcast public hearings, and people can submit via GoToWebinar comments and watch we've had open houses with periods where people could provide feedback, and we had, intermittent presentations. So it's taken a lot of different forms.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, there's basically two types of hybrid. You can do hybrid at the same time or at different times. And so, sometimes you have a public meeting and you can also have a digital experience at the same time. People can be at the public meeting online or face to face, or you have a public meeting and then you have a survey or something in between public meetings. And so there's all kinds of different ways of doing hybrid, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. So lots of approaches there. And I think, again, it would be useful for us to share some case studies with people about how different teams have approached it, just so people can kind of pick the approach that most resonates with. And I think that's as practitioners, that's one of the best things that we can do, is just to provide examples so people can feel like they can replicate other teams' success, because we all learn from each other. Peer-to-peer is the most powerful learning that we have. Thank you, Amy, Jamil, and Lloyd, for all of your thoughts during this process on the webinar. So valuable. Lots of your thoughts are baked into the report. People stand by. We're going to send you that report. And thank you, everyone online, for joining us. Wonderful turnout today. And stay tuned for all of the worms that we've unleashed. We're going to be trying to address in future webinars and presentations. But this has really opened up so many interesting discussions that we hope to continue over the next year. So stick with us, and we will work through these challenges together, peer-to-peer learning. And thanks again to everyone for joining us. And the last thanks go to you folks. Thank you so much for participating today's panel. You guys have been great, as always.